This week we will be talking about prenatal concerns. We're going to talk a little bit about the prenatal development, some different factors that come up in this lifespan stage, some social factors, some political factors, some different things to consider, some medical factors. The book obviously covers a lot of this information, and I'm not really a person who believes in recovering the information that you've already read about. So instead, we're going to pick some factors that are related to what you've read about and expand upon what you've read about. Okay, so prenatal development. So something that's interesting at prenatal development that is very political is there's this one-child policy. A lot of us have heard about it in China. We're going to look into it a little bit. So it's famous in China, but other countries have kind of similar policies. It began in China in 1979, and it began actually to be phased out in 2015 because what they found is that they weren't meeting the replacement rate, so too much of the population was gray, as they call it, meaning elderly, and there wasn't enough of younger people to come and sustain it. So now it's generally speaking a two-child policy because the replacement rate for a population is 2.1 children, every couple having 2.1 children. Obviously, it's impossible to have 0.1 children. There are exceptions allowed for ethnic groups, specific ethnic groups. Sometimes if the first child was a female, because in China it's very much males are looked at as superior to females. In fact, the vast majority of children that are aborted are females. So the one-child policy, from a lot of socio-political standpoints, is killing far more women than men, and targeting females to be executed. There are fines for violations. There are registered children, and the households are inspected. So there are some children who are born, but they were not a registered child. They were maybe more than one or more than two. And so they're considered to kind of not exist in the society. And it's a very lonely existence for them. They can't go to school. They can't get a lot of resources. A lot of times they're not allowed to marry. They can't do things. So they're almost, I think one of the terms is ghost children. And of course, a lot of them are not children anymore. A lot of them are adults. But in a lot of ways, they are not recognized as existing by their government. Households are inspected for compliance. It is important to note that not all areas of China are under the one policy equally. Different provinces are under different areas. So this is something that, though there is a lot of uniformity over the entire country, it is different for each province. They do have their own rules. About 75% of Chinese residents supported the policy in 2008. So that's a pretty big majority that supported it. And again, we can see that this led to a shortage of females. There were 119 males to 100 females, meaning that there were about 20 males for every group that potentially wanted to get married that were not able to get married. And of course, that's 20% is a very big percentage. Okay, so as we talked about a little bit earlier, this also led to an unsupported elderly population. I was told a story by a Chinese person who came over to visit America for a few months. She said it's not uncommon that you go to a park in China and what you will see is you'll see one grandchild followed by 4 grandparents. Because 4 grandparents make up only one grandchild. That only leads to one grandchild. And so they will follow their grandchild around, all 4 of them, desperately wanting to do anything they can for their one grandchild, because that is the one grandchild that all 4 of them will ever have. So again, we think of that one child to grow up and need to support 4 grandparents and 2 parents. That is a very hard to sustain situation. Okay, so some questions to ask, just to kind of think about it. And if we were in a class together, we would all kind of discuss this and maybe have a debate, and we have different opinions. I certainly hope people have different opinions. But what are some of the pros and cons of a one-child policy? Just can you think of any pros and cons that might exist for a one-child policy? What other ways could a society address problems of overpopulation and or resource scarcity. Now, something that I think is very interesting about overpopulation and resource scarcity is that this has been a problem, or this has been a concern, I should say, for centuries. People have been concerned about this. But what has always happened is that as the population has grown, resources have continued to grow. So it's something that generations continue to be more and more and more scared of, but the problem never catches up with us because we always invent new ways to produce more. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would encourage you to look up a man named Patrick Allit. I believe it's Allit is how you spell his last name. But he talks a lot about this. And one of the facts that he uses to explain this is that, and people always think, oh, our world is so deforested. But in the United States in the 1900, there were fewer trees in 1900 in America than there are now. And there's a lot of other things with that because we've changed the way we do things. So as our population has grown, as other populations around the world have grown, we do not face this as a whole. Now, certainly independent countries and independent nations face this, but typically when they face it, it usually has something to do more with their political structure than it does with actual resources not existing. So in Africa, we see a lot of starvation and such in Africa. It's usually not about the resources not existing. It's usually more about the fact that there's a lot of warlords that take the resources and keep them for themselves. Or in China we see this, right? But it usually has more to do with the fact that the communist government that overturned the previous government about I guess it was in the 50s. So the communist government that is now ruling China has not always been there, and actually hasn't even been there for very long. They overtook it by a bloody coup, and millions of people died. And that communist government now restricts who can have stuff and who can't. Certain ethnicities are deemed less desirable, and so they are not given allocations of things, and so things are taken from them. So yeah, it is absolutely true that there's a resource scarcity, but it's not really because the resources don't exist. It's because the political structure is taking them away from groups that are not liked by that political structure at the moment. How would you feel about being told you can only have one child? How would you feel about the government telling you what you could or could not do? What kind of government would be able to dictate how many children citizens can have? So certainly in our government, we have a republic democracy. Our government does not have the power. This is not something that the government, we as the people have not given the government the power to dictate these life choices. So our government would not have the power to do this. We would revolt as we should, because this is not something our government has the power to do. There are, however, certain governments that do have pretty absolute power over what their people can do. Cuba, for instance, can dictate exactly what their people do. That's the system of the government until it's overthrown. China, for example, can dictate because they have absolute power over what their people could do. So there are some governments that could dictate this, and there are some governments that are set up such that they couldn't dictate this. Okay, so we're going to switch a little bit and we talk about testing. Now, testing was covered a little bit in the prenatal section. I want to just kind of go over some of this. Some of you are very familiar with the medical industry, but I want to go over this a little bit for those of you who are not. We're not going to get in depth, but I'm just going to cover a little bit. So again, we talk about a true positive and a false negative. So a true positive means that somebody, they were shown to have a condition, a test or an indicator showed or indicated that they have a condition, and they do indeed have it. A false negative would be a test that shows they don't have something and they do have it. So it's a false negative, meaning it's a negative, but it's wrong. It says they don't have it, but they actually do. There's a false positive, right, which says that they have it, but they don't actually have it. And then there's a true negative, which says they don't have it and they don't actually have it. Now, this is something we've heard a lot about, right, with, like COVID testing, other testings and stuff that have been in the news lately. And it's important just to understand how these work. True positive, false negative, false positive, and true negative. Something else that is important to know is that every test has an error rating. They're going to be wrong or right within certain percentages. So just because something says, yep, you have it, or yes, you have a marker, that is not the same as you actually knowing that you have it. Or just because something says, no, you don't have it, you don't have the markers, or whatever the test may be looking for, it's important to keep in mind that that does not mean you do not have it. So we're going to look at something a little bit more in depth, just to kind of show you some of the subtleties of the math, and hopefully really encourage you to be your own medical advocate. Because remember, no one's ever going to be as good of a medical advocate for you as you will be for yourself if you're informed. Okay, so this is, again, just an example to break things down, but it kind of shows you the complexity. Interestingly enough, when this was administered, I forget what the number of physicians it was administered to see if they could correctly compute it. I think it was only like 10% or less of the physicians could correctly computed the accuracy of the test. So keep in mind that your physician is not going to be a really good go-to source for this. Physicians kind of famously are bad at math. So keep that in mind, that this is going to be information that you probably need to go and research on your own and run your own numbers in order to get good info on like false, positive, and negative, and what the chances are you really have something. Okay, so again, this is just an example. Estimate the probability that a woman has breast cancer given a positive mammogram result and a base rate for this type of cancer of 1%, a sensitivity rate for the test of 80%, and a false positive rate for the test of 9.6. Okay, so we're going to review what all those things mean. Okay, so a base rate for this type of cancer would mean that we expect about 1% of the population to have it. About 1% of the population has this type of cancer on average, so that's our base rate. A sensitivity rate for the test of 80%, meaning it detects correctly 80% of breast cancer that is out there. So the sensitivity rate is 80%. It correctly detects 80% of the breast cancer samples that it is given. And a false positive rate for the test of 9.6%, meaning that it is going to say that a person does have breast cancer when they don't. So a false positive 9.6% of the time. So these are pretty standard things that you should know about any test that you're administered. What's the base rate, what's the sensitivity rate, and what's the false positive rate. When you have those pieces of information, you can plug in the other data and you can get the chances that your test result is accurate. Okay, so given a base rate of 1%, we would expect 10 out of 1,000 women to have breast cancer, right? So, because 1% of 1,000 is 10. So, we're going to deal with 1,000 women just for the sake of ease right now. So, we would expect 10 of those women to actually have breast cancer. Of these 10, we would expect 8 to test positive because the test has, right, an 80% sensitivity rate, right? 80% of 10 is 8. The results for these 8 women are true positives, meaning they do have it and they are being told they have it. The test results of 2 women are false negatives, meaning because it's only 80%, it's going to miss 20%, right? So 2 women got false negatives, meaning they were told they don't have it and they do. Among the 990 women without breast cancer, because remember the base rate's 1%, 1% of 1,000 is 10, so we expect 10 out of 1,000 to have it, so there's 990 other women left that don't have it out of the base rate. So among the 990 women without breast cancer, 95 will test positive, given the fact that it's a 9.6% positive rate, right? So 9.6% of 990 is 95. So that's how many people will get a false positive rate, meaning they will be told they have it and they do not. The results for these women are false positives. The results for the remaining 895 women are true negatives. Okay, so let's break down what we have so far. So 895 women out of 1,000 are told, after going through this test, are told they do not have breast cancer and they do not have it. 95 women are told they have it and they do not. 2 women are told they do not have it, and they do. 8 women are told they do have it, and they do. Okay, so then let's add the 8, which is the women who do have true positives, and then 95, the women who have false positives, and this sample of 1,000, and so that's how many, 103 out of our sample of 1,000 that will test positive, even though we know that these women are false positives, right? Only these women are true positives. Only 8% are true positives. Thus, the conditional probability that a woman testing positive actually has cancer is the percentage of a positive test result divided by the total positive test results, which equals 0.077 or 7.7%. So what this would mean if all of these numbers are true, and I don't believe these numbers are true anymore about breast cancer tests, but it's used for example. If all these numbers are true, then what we would expect is that if a woman actually takes a breast cancer test and is told that she has breast cancer or gets a positive from the test, she still actually only has a 7.7% chance of actually having the cancer. because the test has a 9.6% false positive rate. So I hope all of this makes sense, right? Because just let's say you take a test and it says, oh, you have something. It could potentially be that you actually still have a very tiny, less than 10% chance of actually having that, even though a test said you did. So keep this in mind, know these numbers. Whenever there's a test of any importance that's being run on you, ask them, what's the base rate? What's the sensitivity rate for the test, and what's the false positive rate of the test? And if they don't know those three things, then maybe get better medical care to start out with, because those are the three things that you need in order to know how reliable your test results actually are. Okay, so another thing that's kind of briefly talked about, we talked about teratogens and all those things, right, and how they affect prenatal development. But what about the generational impact over time, right? So there's an interesting case I wanted to just spend a little bit of time with you guys, and I thought some of you might find it interesting. So, nuclear impact, right? So this has come up. I spent some time in Ukraine, and Chernobyl is still a very big thing, and it's still talked about. And the genetic generational component is discussed a lot theoretically, and then also, being researched. Okay, so looking at nuclear impact. So 2 to 15 weeks after conception is when children are most vulnerable. Ionizing radiation affects a child even if it doesn't hurt a mother. Isn't that interesting? So it can hurt a child in the womb even if the mother isn't injured. And 2 to 15 weeks of gestation is the time when that child is most vulnerable to ionizing radiation. Some things that it has been shown to impact are growth retardation, cancer, cognitive brain functioning, and then some malformations like developments of arms and legs and some things like that. It's been shown to have an impact on. This certainly does not mean that if a child is not in this period that ionizing radiation could not affect them. What it means is that this tends to be when they are most vulnerable to ionizing radiation. And of course, when we look at prenatal development and we look at what's going on in 2 to 15 weeks and what's developing, how their brain is growing, what's going on with their heart and all that, we can maybe understand why this would be a period in which they're especially vulnerable. So the interesting thing is that so far, it appears that it actually doesn't pass on to the next generation. So this was a concern for a long time that the nuclear impact of different things like Chernobyl would affect the developing child, and then because it had affected their genes, it would then affect children that they had. So it would become something that never really left that society or civilization. So far, it is appearing that that's not the case. I would say that I still think a lot more research needs to be done on this field, but right now it's indicating that it does not appear to be the case, or it does not appear to strongly be the case. Okay, so something a little bit more close to home, because Chernobyl is something that probably a lot of us are not super concerned with, but FASD in Alaska. Now that is something that every Alaskan should be aware of, and if any women of childbearing age should be aware of and concerned with. So FASD stands for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and Alaska is consistently the highest, or one of the highest, battling back and forth between first and second place for the highest percentage of children who have this diagnosis in the United States of America. This is not a good distinction. We do not want this distinction. We would like this distinction to go away. This, I think, is very interesting right now in a breakdown of these numbers. So these numbers were from 1996 to 2011 per 1,000 live births. You got to keep that in mind. So if a child died before they were born because they were so greatly impacted by fetal exposure to alcohol, they would not be counted in this. So this could mean that actually the impact of alcohol use to prenatal development to children is much, much, much greater, because these numbers are only counted once the child actually got to a live birth. Okay, so just some numbers to look at. So Wasilla, right? Excuse me, I apologize. Anchorage-Matsu area, 8 children out of 1,000 live births. The Gulf Coast, 14.4 out of 1,000, right? Look at this. Look at this, right? We all know that alcohol is a big problem for some of the smaller areas up here off the road system. 34.6%. And then in the Southwest, 18.8. Those numbers are huge. Those numbers are huge. And really those numbers are pretty unprecedented anywhere else in the United States. Those are profound. And each one of those numbers represents a child who will be impacted for the rest of their life by their mother's alcohol consumption when they were developing. It is important to remember that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a spectrum. There are some children who are greatly impacted by it, and there are also children who are not impacted by it very much at all. They have minor difficulties, minor problems maybe with spatial relations or mathematical sequencing or things like that. And then there are other children who are greatly impacted by it and will never lead a normal life, probably never live on their own, never marry, never have children. Okay, so some other stats, just kind of put it in another form for us to see that this is a huge, huge problem in the United States. Alaska has the highest rate of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in the nation. Over 120 year diagnosed with FASD every year. 120 children. That's about 1 every 3 days. Each child will cost the state of Alaska between $860,000 and $4.2 million from birth to age 18. Now, some people might say, oh, well, what do we care about money? Well, the important thing to keep in mind here is that, first of all, this money is coming from somewhere, right? So it comes from taxpayers and it comes from other places. And if this money wasn't spent on children who had FAS, it could be spent on other things. So if we as a society could educate people so that, everybody took responsibility for their own decisions, if women who are sexually active were aware of things and so they abstained from alcohol when they might conceive, we would see this drastically decrease or just completely be eliminated. And then we would have money to, instead of be, taking care of problems and be helping people, instead of just, helping people get back to ground zero, we could be taking this money to help prevention, to help build positive things. This is a scary number right here. 60% of mothers who had a child born with FAS report they didn't know they were pregnant when consuming alcohol. So again, this is one of the reasons that women of childbearing age who are sexually active, they need to be aware, because they're responsible for their behavior, whether they're aware of the consequences or not. Just like, people who get in the car drunk and they're like, well, I didn't know anybody was going to be on the road and I felt like I was fine. We're responsible for the choices that we make, whether we're aware of all the, ins and outs or not. And then this is to me, this is a disheartening number and also a very encouraging number. FASD is 100% preventable. 100%. Okay, so these are some physical signs of FASD. You see an upturned nose, a smooth film, the little area right below the nose, that kind of goes up and it's like a little ridge right above the lips and below the nose. Flat nasal bridge, small openings between the eyelids, thin upper lip. So these are not like definitive, but they are pretty good indicators. If you see somebody with most of these facial features, there's a really good chance they have FAS. Again, not 100%. Some people who have FASD don't have really any of these, and some people have some of these and they don't have FASD. So it's not 100%, but the physical signs, they are a pretty good indicator. Okay, so again, these are just some of the consequences, right? So they're called primary disabilities and secondary disabilities. So these would be things that alcohol directly does to the body of the child, and then this would be things that, because of what the alcohol has done to the body of the child and then grows up as an adult, these are some things that they then have to live with. So for instance, decreased mental stamina, difficulty interpreting and applying abstract concepts, impulsivity and poor judgment. Those things are typically paired with FAS because of how it damages the prefrontal cortex and other things. It does not mean that if you have FAS, you should not be held responsible for these things. What it means is that it's going to be a lot harder for you. You're going to need a lot of extra work and assistance with these. And not surprisingly, people maybe who have especially impulsive and poor judgment, that might lead to problems with employment, incarceration, or confinement. So again, these are considered secondary disabilities. Whether or not you want to call them disabilities or not is up to you. Some people debate that term. But just recognizing that you have one set of problems, and then often that leads to another set of problems. Okay, so here's another historical issue. We talked about a little bit about Chernobyl. So this is another issue. So this actually is based off something that happened in World War II, I believe in Poland. So the question, and again, looking at things through the eyes of research, does experiencing extreme famine when pregnant impact the child for the long run? So this is actually some research that was conducted. There was some famines in Poland. I believe there are 2 waves of famines that had during Poland in World War II. And there were mothers, of course, that were pregnant during this time. And what they did is they actually evaluated the children as they grew up. And they followed them in a longitudinal study, because any study that follows one group over time is called a longitudinal study. Hint, hint. So if you're following one group that were apart, they were in utero when this famine struck, and let's say there's 100 children born in a town during the time period of this famine. And so what you do is you follow those same 100 children, you follow them for the next 45 years. That would be called a longitudinal study. You check in with them every year to look at the progress, the growth, the changes, etc. of this one specific group over time. Okay. So they found that first trimester children had greater risk of heart disease, right? So the children that were in the gestational, they were in the first trimester when this struck. They had a greater risk of heart disease later on, obesity, unhealthy cholesterol. Second and third trimester children, so they were older, they were further along in gestation and growth, had greater risk of diabetes, appeared to need continued deprivation for a while after birth as well. Enrichment after birth could substantially decrease negative effects. So what this means is that if they did not have continued deprivation after birth, and they had immediate enrichment after birth, even if in their second and third trimester they had experienced quite a bit of famine, they could recover very, very quickly if they experienced enrichment right after birth. If, however, they continued to experience deprivation for a while after birth, then we saw these risks increase. Okay, so some questions. And again, putting that research hat back on, right? If you wanted to know how long you must maintain an enriched environment for a child after birth in order to significantly decrease their risk from prenatal deprivation, how would you set up your study? Okay, so what the question that you're after is like kind of springboarding off the last thing we looked up, right? So we found out that in that longitudinal study that the children had enrichment, even if they had a lot of deprivation, extreme deprivation in utero. But if they were born and immediately had enrichment, that did a lot. If they were in their second and third trimesters when they experienced the deprivation, that enrichment right after birth did a lot to help them bounce back. So we're thinking, okay, well, how long must they maintain a rich environment for a child after birth in order to significantly decrease their risk if they had deprivation in prenatal stage? Does the enrichment need to really take place for a week, for a month, for a year? How long does that enrichment really need to take place? Do you need to put extra emphasis on the enrichment in order to balance out some of the prenatal deprivation? So that's something you're interested in studying. So we think about, okay, how are we going to study that? How are we going to study that? Okay, so clearly there's some things we're not going to do. Right, we're not going to set somebody up who is in their second and third trimester, a mother who's in the second, third trimester with a child, and we're not going to set her up to be very deprived. So we're not going to. That would be unethical. That would be very wrong. We're not going to do that. So how are we going to learn about this if it's not going to be a study that we set up every element of? Okay, well, this is one of those things. A lot of times people say, "Oh, double blind. Double blind's the way to go." Double blind is really great. It's really good when you can do research that is double blind. Double blind meaning that the people who are participating in the study are not aware of which treatment they're given, and also the people administering the treatment are not aware. Sometimes people consider this the only form of research that they will regard or trust. But first of all, I'll tell you that the double blind studies are just as easy to manipulate as anything else. Maybe they're slightly harder just because more people are involved sometimes, usually, but they can absolutely be easily manipulated too. But something to keep in mind is that there's a lot of things that you can't do a double-blind study for because it's not ethical. It's not ethical. A lot of people know, we have a ton of data showing that smoking cigarettes leads to lung cancer and death. This is very well established by looking at percentages, looking at death rates, looking at the longevity of smoking. Does it mean that everybody who smokes dies of lung cancer? No, not everybody. There's always that one exception, right? My Uncle Bob lived to 101, he smoked a pack a day. Sure, there are exceptions. There are people who get, metal rods that go through their brain and live. It doesn't happen very often. I wouldn't recommend it and think that you'll live, but, we always have crazy outliers. What we want to do is not make our decisions based on outliers. That's not a really good way to make a decision, to make an informed decision. But one of the things about smoking is that we actually don't have double-blind studies for smoking because we would consider it unethical to assign one group to smoke a pack a day and one group to not. That would be considered unethical because we do know that smoking causes damage. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot you can't get from a double-blind. And in this study, what you would probably need to do is actually find women who had self-reported or for some reason had already experienced deprivation. And then you would need to research how long had they had an enriched environment for the child afterwards, and then look at how that child developed over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years, and then that might give you a good estimate. So this might very well be research that took you most of your life to conduct. Okay, another thing to think about. If you wanted to know how long you could wait after birth before beginning an enriched environment for a child who had experienced prenatal deprivation and still see effects significantly decrease, how would you set up your study? So again, this is very significant, right? They're very significant studies. But notice how this study is kind of focusing on the positive a little bit more. This one is really wanting to see, okay, in order to significantly decrease the risk, how long do you have to have an enriched environment? And what this one is wanting to see is, if you want to see those negative effects significantly decrease, how long do you wait after birth? Do you have to do it right away? What if a child experienced a lot of deprivation in utero and man, it's already been 6 months? Is it too late to do an effective intervention if you come in and help with an enriching environment right then? So they're very similar questions, and the research would have a lot of overlap, but it's important also to notice it has a different focus and a different point of application at the end. Even though absolutely these two research studies could potentially be done at the same time with a lot of the same components, it is important to note that they're getting at different things. When we talk about research, several of you had different things that you were interested in in the Blackboard, different things you're interested in that were similar to each other, but focused slightly differently on the question or how you would engage the research. Okay, so this is just the last slide, just some references for you guys, so that if there's anything here that you want to learn more about, you can.